The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Fortier. I'm the Communications and Member Services Coordinator here with New Hampshire Municipal Association. And I'm joined today by folks from the Southern New Hampshire Regional Planning Commission, starting right at the top with its Executive Director, Sylvia von Aulock. Good afternoon, Sylvia.
Hi, Tim.
I see you've invited a couple of your staff people with us today. Could you introduce them to us, please?
Yes, I have two planners with me. It's Derek Schuster and Maddie Diano.
And I take it they were very involved in the development of this age-friendly project?
Maddie, not from the start, but has been very involved. But we're going to talk about that. Tim, I don't want to get ahead of it. Let me give some background on the project.
That sounds great. Then I'll turn the tables over to you, Sylvia.
Thanks, Tim. So first, let me just say that this project, Becoming Age Friendly for our communities, has been funded by Tufts Health Plan Foundation with contributions from AARP and New Hampshire DOT and Manchester Health Department. We've also had several collaborating agencies, including Engaging New Hampshire, Manchester Regional Area Committee on Aging, the New Hampshire State Committee on Aging, our local university, SNU, and in town Manchester, Alliance for Healthy Aging, and all our Southern New Hampshire planning communities. So just a little bit about the background of this project. This started when I first heard AARP's Livable Communities program, where they plan community programs, services, infrastructure, and all thinking, let's design communities that would be good whether you're 8 years old or 80 years old. And I thought this was a fantastic way to design a community. And some of the questions we had were, how are communities preparing to serve the needs for our growing senior populations? How can our region attract young adults? We know that the senior population in New Hampshire is growing, yet our young population is leaving the state. So that's a huge concern for us. We wondered if residents, both seniors and millennials, knew about programs, services, and businesses within our community that had age-friendly services. We wondered if there were opportunities and synergies between these two populations. And finally, how could our region unite to create collective solutions? So we created this program, and luckily we're funded by Tufts Health Plan Foundation. And both for phase 1 and phase 2, I'm going to talk about phase 1, the several parts of that. And then Derek will come in and talk about some of the business and economic development aspects of it. Maddie will talk about our library assessments. And then Derek and Maddie will wrap up with phase 2. So let me start with phase 1, which was really understanding our communities and how were they really working with senior populations? Did they even get that senior population was growing? Were they creating services? Were they designing infrastructure, especially with consideration to seniors? And also, what about millennials? Were they trying to make sure that the millennial population, maybe their businesses had Wi-Fi, or their town offices, were there programs for young families to bring the young families back into the communities? So we did these assessments. Some of the tasks within this phase, we wanted to make sure that our communities were well represented. We had a stakeholder team from interested communities and agencies that helped guide our project. We worked with the Manchester Health Department to form an advisory committee, and in fact that ended up being that we dovetailed with an existing committee, which the acronym is Mr. ACOA, a fun acronym, really standing again for Manchester Regional Area Committee on Aging. We researched case studies on age-friendly communities in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Maine, and Vermont. And then we completed our community assessments, identifying assets, opportunities, and roadblocks within 4 targeted land use areas. We also were very interested in surveying local residents and businesses. And then at the end of this program, our first year, we organized a wonderful age-friendly public forum to share our findings. Getting the word out. Our team was dedicated in making sure people knew about the program. So we dovetailed with a lot of existing efforts. We went on public TV. What you see here is the Sandy Hicks show, and Todd Fahey and I, Todd Fahey is the Executive Director of New Hampshire AARP. We went on to her program, and Sandy had us talk about what it means to be an age-friendly community. We worked with many of the existing agency programs and went to a lot of meetings. We made a lot of phone calls. We went on Facebook and did a lot of website work, of course. We also made sure the community champions, and we work with 14 communities, but we made sure their champions knew about the program. We really wanted people to know about our age-friendly efforts. And so then we had our, this is a slide of all the different efforts we did to make sure we had input, and that included our community conversations. And we'll talk about the rest of these a little bit, but since it's right in front of me, I can't resist. We did resident surveys. We were really interested in knowing also about what the home building industry, why more diversity of housing wasn't happening, why it wasn't being built. And I don't want to steal Derek's thunder, but we also did some business assessments, and Maddie will talk about those library assessments. So 14 community conversations. How did we get all these communities together? I love this slide, herding cats, and that's kind of how it was, but how did we make it happen? Well, food, right? You got to have food at a meeting, and whether it was a pizza party in Auburn or a dinner in Goffstown, food made it happen, and we were very lucky that one of our sponsors, ARP, was willing to foot the bill for the food. And so this is a picture of the town office in Auburn. Our first assessment and community conversation started in Auburn. And we were really interested in having a diverse group come and talk to us, and that's exactly what happened. We had people from the library, from police and fire departments, historic district commissions, parks, planning, of course, town administrator, the churches were involved, civic. We had residents, of course, volunteers, and some local businesses did get involved as well. So it was a really great group of people from many different aspects of life talking to us about the program. The areas of focus that we talked about and really stressed had to do with land use, and the 4 areas included housing, the trends, the needs, the diversity of housing or the lack of, and zoning. Transportation was the second item on the ticket, and we really stressed a lot about accessibility, making connections, and then recreation and engagement, that kind of quality of life sort of thing. And then finally, our 4th topic was age-friendly businesses and economic development. This is a picture of a community conversation that was held at the library in Ware. And Mike Sullivan, the librarian there, was great in getting this group together. But one thing we realized is depending on who came to the conversation really steered the direction of that conversation. So if we had a young person in the audience, like this case in Ware, we would have never heard about snowmobile trails, for example. Whereas in Londonderry, where probably the average age of the participant was about 80, we didn't hear, of course, about snowmobile trails. They weren't that rowdy there in Londonderry. But so we knew from that we needed more information. So we focused on the resident surveys, and this was wonderful. AARP and their 8 domains of livability. If you have a minute, please do Google this, because it's a wonderful tool, and we'll talk about this. Maddie will talk about this a little bit later. But they had an existing survey, which was an 8-page survey, Tim, and everyone told us no one's going to answer an 8-page survey, right? It just sounds painful saying it now. But we narrowed that down to 6 pages, and in fact, we had 641 participants. It was awesome. And again, we did a home building industry survey. Again, this was online, SurveyMonkey, that we sent to developers, home builders, landowners, engineers, anyone that would be involved in building homes. So let's talk a little bit about what we found. On this graph, what you can see is the age distribution for people who live in our Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission region. And that's in the blue. And in this pink color are our survey participants. And what we expected that a lot of seniors would participate. You can see that 34% from 51 to 65 and the 24%. But the number we were most proud of was that age group between 25 and 35. We really worked hard to get their participation, and I think it was thanks to Derek and his work on Facebook and getting the word out that we got that percentage up. So that was a bit about who participated in our survey. This is a great map here. It tells you our region, and the darker the red, the more participants. So that's Manchester in the center, and Francistown is our community out to the west, and Deerfield to the northeast, and Windham down to the south there. But you notice how there are multiple other communities that participated. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Thank you. I know. Thank you, Derek and Maddie. They're all amazed at this map. So,
I mean, I'll add one thing to that. That's one of the nice things about adapting the survey to be online is it was easy to share, and there was a fear from the stakeholder group that seniors and older people wouldn't take the survey if it was online, but we saw just as wide participation from the online survey as we did from the physical printed handouts of it.
That's right. Yeah, we had both paper and online, so it was easily done. But you can see on the map, the farthest north community, that's actually Wolfboro. The farthest east there is Portsmouth. The farthest west is Keene. And down to the south there is Salem and Nashua. So really interesting that we had people that far from our communities participate. So you can look at this a couple ways. One, you can think, well, are these folks commuting into the Manchester area and then finding out about it there? Or did someone send them a link to this? So it's really curious. But what I loved about it was that these people were interested enough, even though they didn't live within our region, they were interested enough to take the 6-page survey, and they also could bring this idea of being an age-friendly community back to their communities. Because I am hoping that all this talk about age-friendly community will become a state discussion. All right, some of the things we asked about, for example, as far as senior services, are in-home services assistance available in your community? Well, many people said yes, but notice how many people were, sorry, it's not on this graph, it's somehow lost, but the bottom bar is actually unsure. The no is the blue. So many people are unsure. That may be because they haven't found a need for services yet. That might be the younger crowd, or they just are not quite ready to ask for services yet. But unsure that many, it just screams we need to let people know how to find those services. What concerns you the most about aging in your community? This tells so much. Number one, transportation. Notice the green bar, which is the millennial answer, and the purple is the senior answer. Both seniors and millennials felt that transportation was number one. And look at the number two response, recreation and engagement. That's really, again, that quality of life issue. And then housing was number three at about that 50% range for both seniors and millennials. And what we heard often from really all participants was there's not enough diversity and it's not affordable. Notice a little bit where things switch up and there's a big difference. Medical services shouldn't surprise anyone, where the millennials, only about 24 or a quarter of the millennials responding were concerned about medical services, whereas almost half of the seniors were. And then look down the last one with jobs, where 44% it was a big concern for millennials. But we love this quote from a resident in Ware: we need more transportation and housing options. Once that's worked out, everything else falls into place. Doesn't that make complete sense? So we're going to take each one of our focused areas in the next few slides and talk about what worked well and what were some of the roadblocks. So for transportation services, what worked well? Well, municipal transportation. This is the green dash in downtown Manchester. The Municipal Transit Authority has great public service in Manchester. But we also heard about trails. Everyone wants a walkable community. Doesn't matter how old you are. They want to be able to leave their home and be able to walk on a sidewalk or a trail. And this was a senior walking group that I basically followed and shadowed for one morning, asking them what they cared about. And it was all really about more trails, more walkability. They just want to keep fit. Another thing that works well, and Derek, why don't you talk a little bit about that, is the new bike stations in Manchester.
Yeah, so a local bike advocacy organization, Bike Manchester, was interested in seeing a bike share program take shape in Manchester, New Hampshire, which is the state's largest city. So this past summer, they actually launched 6 stations, and it's enabled a conversation with businesses and organizations and really the community, the ability to see biking become a bigger part of how to get around the city. It's been well received so far, and the initial data looks like people are actually riding it. Just the one thing they want is more stations, more places to bike to, which echoes what we heard from our resident surveys about the desire for additional transportation options and places to explore.
Exactly. And I think within the first couple months, right, there was over 300 participants in that program.
There's about 300 registered users, and we're coming up to about 1,000 rides so far, which for a system with only 6 stations, most of which are bunched closely together, that's pretty exciting. So we're hoping to see more of that throughout the region as well.
So that's something that worked well. And the last one, that upper right-hand photo, is a bridge that links in New Boston, sort of their downtown area with their beautiful new library. In New Boston, residents didn't feel safe walking the road, especially during commuter hours, where the shoulders are nearly non-existent. But so what they did was focus on this beautiful trail system so that you could walk from downtown to the library. So those were things that worked well. Of interest here, so a lot is happening on this slide. What didn't work well: if you don't drive, you can't exist in this town. I can't tell you how many of our rural communities said that. I would say it was universal. On the left, this chart is answers from millennials. On the right, from seniors, when asked, how would you rate your community's transportation options if you were unable to drive? And you can see it was either very poor or poor, and only 1% said excellent. If they said other, that was usually, well, we don't know yet. We're drivers and we're not sure what to say. But this screams we need to do something about transportation services. Housing, what works well? What we heard quite a bit was, especially in the communities where they had allowances in zoning for multifamily, whether it was 2 to 4 unit structures or 5+ unit structures, it was that we were so grateful for mixed housing. One young woman in Hooksett said, if it wasn't for the duplex we bought in Hooksett, we couldn't have moved here. So we know there's a lot of single family units, but interesting to see how many 2 to 4 unit housing structures there are, as well as multifamily. One of the questions we asked was, if your home has multiple levels or outdoor entry steps, have you considered modifying your home that you could age in place? We've heard that phrase, right, quite a bit, age in place. So someone who can, they've brought their family up in the home and they want to stay there. They know their neighborhood, they know their doctor, they know their downtown, so they want to stay there. How can they age in place? Well, if they have multiple levels, after a while, it's very difficult to maneuver within your home. And you can see that on the left, not many people are actually considering modifying their home. The right chart tells us a lot about, do you have more than one level in your home? You see that turquoise blue area, single level. That's really about 10% of the participants said they only had one level. The rest were all multi-level, which really tells, I guess, the building industry, hey, step up to the plate and start advertising, we can modify your home and help you stay in your home. So what did we hear about roadblocks? This was very common. I own a big home. I'm 66 years old. New Hampshire has nothing for me. It's so expensive. That sentiment was one of the first things we heard that helped us really design this whole program. Was a woman from Chester who said, I love my community, but there are absolutely no options. There's no multifamily housing. There's no single level housing. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go. On the other hand, we also heard from young people, I'd love to keep living here, but there aren't really very many affordable options for younger adults. Just trying to find a place to rent in a town like Chester or Ware or Francistown, it's really non-existent. One of the questions we asked, whether you wanted to move into your first home or into a smaller home, does your community offer appealing alternatives? You can see the answer here. No and unsure are pretty dominant in this one. Why isn't there more housing diversity? So I had mentioned we had surveyed the people who actually build the housing. And this is what we understood. Here's one of the questions. As New Hampshire's demographics change, do you see a need to build more diversity in housing? Smaller homes for seniors, rental units for millennials? Well, you can see, outstanding, screaming almost at us here is yes. So the obvious next question was, well, why do you think there isn't more diversity in housing? So the development industry said zoning restrictions. That was a big one. 70% or so said that. Regulatory challenges, community attitudes, no doubt that's the not in my backyard we are all familiar with. Land availability, and then to a lesser extent, you see things like the labor cost and funding issues. So some of these things we would hope to address with our communities so that we could create more diversity in housing. Our third target area was recreation and engagement. What did we hear that worked really well? Unique partnerships. Every community had wonderful stories about the Boy Scouts partnering with a local business or a church partnering with the Audubon Society. Just every, I guess, combination you could imagine, there were unique partnerships. Any ideas? Yeah.
One thing we learned was that most of our communities do not have community centers or dedicated community rooms, and Sylvia will gladly talk more about these places. The libraries really have become the community centers in most of our communities, and in some communities that's been fine. The libraries were quite large and able to accommodate varying needs, whether it be for dance classes or Boy Scout meetings or AA meetings or whatever. But other communities, their libraries might be historic or smaller, and they just don't have the resources to meet the demands that the various community groups have for the spaces. So librarians and libraries in particular, which I know Maddie's going to talk more about as well, were interesting because among planning exercises, librarians typically aren't part of that conversation, but they were probably one of our most helpful stakeholders and informers on this front with becoming age friendly.
Exactly. And Derek touched on one of the things that did work was that allowance to utilize different types of venues. We heard about church basements and high school auditoriums and elementary school gymnasiums, all being utilized for things that they weren't necessarily built for, but they were available to use for different groups and agencies. And aside from libraries, parks and recreation departments have become instrumental in both senior and younger folks' sort of that quality of life programming. And of course, there's always those community champions that without them, a program would go away. We heard, for example, in the town of Deerfield, that they still do a local telephone book that they create just through volunteers, so that people can check up on each other and say, hey, are you okay? We know we haven't seen you out of your home for a few days and it's snowing, and are you okay? And it's down to that community telephone book. So community champions were key. One of the things also in our survey, our resident survey, we asked, how do you find out about community services and events? Again, really interesting, the millennial in green and the senior in purple. So Facebook, instrumental. And what surprised me was word of mouth. Look at that. Isn't that wild? Almost 50% word of mouth. Websites, of course, email, a little less for millennials than seniors. And newspapers, very important for seniors. And you can say to some lesser extent, newsletters and community TV and other things. What worked well also with community engagement, and I'll let you talk about this again, Derek, but about their web app here.
Yeah, so the town of Bedford, New Hampshire has what's called the Bedford app, which they basically adapted the town's website into a mobile phone app that residents can use to learn about community events, listen to the radio station for the town, watch local community TV programs, or even pay bills or taxes right through the app, which is just one additional way you can use technology to engage with your citizens.
Exactly. So that worked really well. Yet on the other hand, to go to the other spectrum of not high tech, on the other hand, just something right in your hand, that old-fashioned newsletter, we found that Auburn really won the day with their Auburn Village Crier, where they have a set-aside budget to create this. So it doesn't matter if you are a church and you're announcing that month's breakfast, or you want to put in that you're having a garage sale, or you're a business and you're having an event. It didn't matter who or what or where. The town of Auburn gathers up all these little tidbits, and they put it in a monthly newsletter. It runs 11 months out of the year, and they mail it directly to every single resident in the town, so they know what's going on. We love this example, and the residents love it as well. What were some of the roadblocks? What did we hear? Well, this was very common. Once you're out of the school system, you have no idea what's going on. Because those kids coming home on a Friday with the flyer of what's happening in town, that no longer happens for the residents. So they don't know where to go unless you're a community like Auburn and you have that newsletter you're sending home. There's really few communities that have that one-stop shop of finding out what's happening in town. We often heard the concern about not having a senior center. In our rural communities, the no places to shop or meet with friends to have a cup of coffee. Not enough meeting space. For example, Derek mentioned some of the libraries that were smaller and there was no place to grow. And with knowing that libraries have become community centers without a meeting space, they were really stuck, and complained about not being able to expand. So take it, Derek, on business and economic development.
Thanks, Sylvia. So an interesting item we wanted to tackle with our Becoming Age-Friendly program was thinking about age-friendly businesses and seeing what the overlap was in senior and millennial desires out of businesses to eventually guide or become a tool for businesses in our communities. So we heard from a number of our communities that the local businesses there have been generous, either through donating goods or services to different community organizations or the towns and the city themselves. Bedford's business district is located conveniently near a highway. It's actually located in the northeast corner of the town. So that both helps to separate businesses from residents and therefore also means they see fewer NIMBY sentiments or complaints. NIMBY means not in my backyard. So that's one thing that Bedford was able to crack down, and that's been good for their tax base. We've also heard a lot that the chambers of commerce do a lot with their communities. They try to foster future leadership among millennials in building relationships. One example of this recently was the Manchester Young Professional Network, which has long been a partner of the Manchester Chamber of Commerce, regionally merged together so that they're going to be working a lot harder at the chamber to engage young people, which should be good for retaining millennials and talented millennials at that in the Manchester area. And finally, central business districts in Manchester, Derry, Bedford, Hooksett, and Goffstown were all celebrated in that A, they exist, and B, they do a good job at being those third places where people can come to grab the cup of coffee, play bar trivia, go dancing, or run the errands that we have day to day. In terms of roadblocks to business and economic development, We did hear from some of our communities, such as from this millennial in Hooksett, that there's nothing there to attract millennials. There's not much to do there. They have to go to Manchester and Concord nearby for those activities. One big obstacle for a number of our towns is that they don't have public water or sewer, which in turn limits business development growth. There are minimum areas zoned for businesses in general. It's mostly large single lot sizes for single family homes. Lack of comprehensive economic development strategies such as corridor plans exist in many of our communities. Access to economically active areas like Boston via rail service was cited as a way to improve New Hampshire's workforce and livability. We have railroads, we just don't have commuter rails on them to get people from communities in our region to places with some of the higher paying jobs in Massachusetts. And finally, lack of high paying jobs in the region as a whole was a deterrent, particularly among millennials who are looking for greener pastures when it comes to finding a job. Again, another quote we heard, "Not in my backyard is alive and well in my town," fill in the blank. So one thing we wanted to do with our program was to actually assess the conditions at businesses for age friendliness. And we partnered with Southern New Hampshire University in town Manchester to perform those. But in order to guide our perspective first, we actually received a lesson on accessibility from an organization out of Portsmouth called Access Portsmouth. Access Portsmouth's goal is to take the mystery out of accessibility in historic Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It was started about a year ago from JSA Inc., an architecture firm outside of Portsmouth, when one of the partners there, his name is Todd Hansen. Todd used to be a marathon runner 10, 11 years ago, was very physically fit. He loved showing friends and family coming to visit Portsmouth what a great town it was. And unfortunately, over the last decade, Todd was stricken with an illness that's not only limited his ability to speak, but it's also left him wheelchair bound. And he realized he could no longer frequent a lot of the businesses he was accustomed to enjoying when in Portsmouth. So he wanted to unlock that mystery of accessing those businesses and thus created Access Portsmouth, which looks for four things. What they do is they perform site visits and they see, is parking accessible to the entry of the business? In this case, they looked strictly at restaurants. Can you get into the front door of the restaurant? They're not ADA police. They were just interested to see if it was 32 inches wide. I think ADA might be 3 or more feet wide. And whether or not there was a flat surface or ramp for a wheelchair or someone with a walker to walk through. The third item they looked for was whether they can use the facility with ease. If you do use a walker or a wheelchair, are you able to move around easily, or are there obstacles in the way? Are aisles wide enough? If there's a potted plant in the middle of the floor, can I navigate around it? And finally, is the bathroom accessible? One thing they noted about their site visits in Portsmouth was a number of restaurants in that town have handlebars in their bathroom, or they have the wide door to go through, but they're on the basement level or on the second floor and maybe don't have an elevator to get up to, which defeats the purpose. But looking for things like a flat entrance, sufficient area to move around the bathroom, and elevator accessibility if it is on a separate floor were things to look for during a site visit. So Sylvia and I had the pleasure of touring a few of the restaurants in Portsmouth to see exactly what it is that we want to look for an accessible business. If you have a bar establishment, maybe don't have just high top tables, but actually have some lower tables so someone in a wheelchair can pull up. Or, just because something's handicap accessible doesn't mean it can't look good, like this bathroom to the right at a seafood restaurant in Portsmouth. And finally, you can even naturally integrate an ADA accessible ramp into your built landscape so that people of all modes and means can navigate throughout your urban area. So with that in mind, the Becoming Age Friendly team partnered with Southern New Hampshire University's Dr. Christina Clamp. She is a sociology professor whose research method students worked with SNHPC to assess more than 20 businesses in person in downtown Manchester. Working with Intown Manchester, we identified which businesses to go to, and we prepared a survey to look for accessibility characteristics, but also other services and characteristics like is customer service presence. Is there loud music? Seniors don't like loud music, which is one of the reasons you don't see them at Abercrombie and Fitch or Hollister or some of those stores in the mall. Another thing we looked for was whether there was Wi-Fi at businesses. Wi-Fi is something that people of all ages like, especially nowadays with the proliferation of smartphones. And some of the things we found was in downtown Manchester, nearly 9 out of 10 businesses did have flat entryways. This surprised us because in Portsmouth, which is a bit older for some of their buildings, that wasn't the case. We were surprised and happy to see that parking and wheelchair accessibility was actually quite common at a number of the businesses we looked at in Manchester, but not so common were tactile surfaces or braille signage, or just easy to read signage in general. Only about half of our businesses had non-slip surfaces or wide aisles, and about 2/3 of businesses were accessible for their bathrooms with handlebars. So moving on from the business assessments, Maddie's going to talk a little more about a similar assessment that was performed at the libraries in our region.
All right, thank you, Derek. So the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission partnered with the Manchester Regional Area Committee on Aging, better known as Mr. ACOA, to perform secret shopper library assessments. So libraries that were visited were in Auburn, Bedford, Goffstown, Hooksett, Manchester, and New Boston. So surveyors rated libraries on accessibility, amenities, technology, and how well the library's programs catered to both seniors and millennials. So one of the first questions that surveyors were asked was how accessible the libraries were. And it was found that 100% of the libraries were wheelchair accessible and had accessible bathrooms with support bars. 9 out of 10 of libraries had flat entryways and non-slip surfaces. Areas where we see opportunity for improvement would be in transportation and signage, specifically braille signage. Again, going back to transportation being the #1 concern for millennials and seniors, only one library out of this sample of libraries provided transportation options to and from the library. And only one library had braille signage for vision impaired patrons. The next question asked surveyors to rate the libraries on the types of amenities they offered. We found that 100% of the libraries offered large print book selections, indoor places to sit, and computers. Many of the libraries offered bicycle storage, outdoor places to sit, bag hooks in the bathrooms, and diaper changing tables in the bathrooms as well. Only 10% of the libraries offered complimentary food or coffee, and very few offered a suggestion box or computers with vision enhancement for vision impaired patrons. Next, the surveyors were asked to explore the library's programs and note down which ones might attract seniors. 100% of the libraries offer some sort of book club, and many of them offer movie screenings, arts and crafts, board games, knitting. Not too many of them offer concerts, and even fewer offer tax assistance or information on scams, which we are seeing a growing demand for as seniors are being increasingly targeted for internet fraud and online scams. Comparatively, surveyors were also asked to note down which programs might attract millennials, and we saw a wide variety of programs offered. We saw speakers, lectures, informational meetings on various topics, family and intergenerational events, and we saw a lot of libraries taking advantage of online and smart device apps such as Hoopla and Instaflix, where library patrons can sign in with their library card and have instant access to the library's complete database and be able to download ebooks, audiobooks, music, and movies, and just have access to all of that right from the comfort of their own home. Also time savers such as quick picks for books, current movies, etc.
So thank you, Maddie. The first phase of our Becoming Age Friendly program culminated in a community forum hosted at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College. This was at the end of May 2017. We had more than 100 participants, including representation from nearly all of our stakeholder groups. Manchester Regional Boston Airport was there, Manchester Boston Regional Airport was there, Manchester Transportation Authority, Mr. Akoa, Engaging New Hampshire, the SCOA was there. We also had Ollie and just a number of really wonderful stakeholders and community representatives. And at the forum, we discussed the 4 focus areas and our findings. AARP New Hampshire was a co-host and on hand to talk more about their 8 domains of livability. We also had professionals from the local real estate community as well as Engaging New Hampshire talk about some of the tastes and things to consider for both seniors and millennials in aging in place and what their tastes are for buying and renting homes around the country and what to consider locally. And finally, we had a panel discussion with experts from our 4 focus areas, take questions from the audience about the different focus areas and what we need to think about moving forward in our region. It was an excellent way to sort of culminate and share our findings from phase 1 with our 14 communities, and from that announce what the next steps were for phase 2 of our program, which we were very pleased to have gotten funding for from the Tufts Health Plan Foundation. Now, phase 2 of our program will enable us to implement pilot programs to work with up to 3 southern New Hampshire communities from our region and 10 businesses to utilize their assessments and create age-friendly strategic plans. How those plans look may differ from one community to the other. Now, moving forward from assessment to strategic plan could mean adapting a chapter of a community's master plan. It could mean creating its own standalone plan in general. In order to figure out how that looks, we're developing an outreach plan to present findings to municipal decision makers. We've already prepared our assessments and reports for each of our 14 communities, and at the moment we're meeting with each community's boards of selectmen and decision makers in order to explain to them that they have this unique opportunity to apply and develop a strategic plan, and that it's at no cost to the municipality. Working with stakeholders on determining who those pilot communities and businesses are. In order to do that, we've established subcommittees for our communities and businesses to really think about what it is we want to look for, who's going to be coming to the plate. If we have all 14 communities interested, how do we pick and choose who we're going to work with for these initial 3 pilots? If all goes well, hopefully in a 3rd phase, maybe we'll have enough funding to go around for more communities. But finally, guiding businesses and communities to become more age-friendly is the goal. And as Sylvia mentioned initially, this is something we'd love to see become a statewide priority. For the phase 2 pilot programs, as I mentioned, we established the subcommittees. We are soliciting community and business participation at the moment, and we'll be looking for 3 communities and 10 businesses. We're not necessarily looking to reinvent the wheel. We've mentioned that AARP New Hampshire has been a great partner for us, and they actually have a network of livable communities and age-friendly communities with a long list of tools at our disposal if a community wishes to participate. And Maddie's going to close out by talking a little more about AARP livable communities.
Sure. So as Derek mentioned, AARP does have its own network of age-friendly communities. This network is made up of just about 200 communities spanning from Maine all the way to Hawaii. Maine actually has the most communities. They have 42 participating communities right now with age-friendly strategic plans. So we chose to analyze a few of these communities, not necessarily in Maine, just to look at some of the things that they've been doing to be successful with their strategic plans. And one of the first ones we looked at is in Newport, Vermont. Newport, Vermont's population is under 5,000, and these were some of the goals they established in their strategic plan. And since their adoption of the plan in 2015, they've been very successful. They've completely revitalized their downtown and are currently undergoing rapid economic growth. But we see right off the bat increasing town information among residents, improving outdoor spaces and buildings, and improving transportation options. We chose this community as an example because 70% of New Hampshire communities have populations of 6,000 residents or less. So we thought this was a great example because this program isn't just designed for places like Portland and Portsmouth or Boston. You know, this is really designed for rural communities as well. Our next example is a more suburban example. It's located in Auburn Hills, Michigan. Its population is under 21,000. These were a few of the goals that this community established in its age-friendly strategic plan. We see designing an age-friendly housing guide, increasing bus and ridership programs, and educating residents about community health services. So similar goals as Newport, Vermont, but we see a few differences. Again, we're seeing that the program has similar framework, but each community can adopt it and make it unique to its own needs. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have an urban example. Salem, Massachusetts adopted an age-friendly strategic plan as well. Its population under 43,000. And right off the bat, we see improving access to public transportation as its #1 goal. Evaluating the safety and walkability of sidewalks and intersections, and improving access to information among older residents. Salem, Mass. Has also been extremely successful in adopting and implementing its age strategic plan. So what we can take away from this is that the Becoming Age-Friendly plan is not a one-size-fits-all program. We're encouraging all communities of all sizes to sign up for this. It's, as I said, not designed for areas like Boston. It's really every community can adopt it and make its own unique twist on it to address the specific needs of each individual community. And with that, I'll have Sylvia wrap it up.
Sylvia, before you get there,
Sure, Tim.
can I ask a quick question? What is the time frame for phase 2 implementation?
All right, so great question. The quick answer is we want to have our 3 communities lined up by the end of January. So that means by mid-January, we want the letters. We're asking any community interested in the pilot program to submit a letter of interest by mid-January. Then we are planning a stakeholder meeting the end of January. We'll review the letters of interest and we'll pick up to 3 communities. The businesses, we're still working on that as well, but I'm imagining a similar time frame. Also, just a different number. That'll be 10 businesses. And Derek's working on that. And then we, as far as going a little bit further down sort of the calendar, what we anticipate is working with the communities between February and March and really diving into the strategic plan, looking at assessments, talking to the community, seeing the direction they want to go in, and then wrapping up strategic plans by May, and then having this phase completed by the end of June.
Very good.
Yeah, we're really excited about this opportunity. We are excited about the program. We know from our community conversations and from our surveys that there is a very high level of interest with community folks. And we really hope that many of our communities will take advantage of this opportunity. There are many resources out there. Of course, we mentioned AARP, Livable Communities. Statewide, there is a program if the folks at home want to check out the Alliance for Healthy Aging. There's also statewide groups such as Engaging New Hampshire. Of course, there's Manchester Health Department and the Tri-State Learning Collaborative on Aging. And our funder, Tufts Health Plan Foundation. There's several programs that have been available. Unfortunately, this one already happened, the Tri-State Learning Collaborative Summit. But the New Hampshire Alliance for Healthy Aging, they have a meeting next week. They have a quarterly meeting, and people are welcome to going to that. Just Google the Alliance for Healthy Aging. And we, of course, want to thank our stakeholders, our participants, and, of course, program funders. Again, Tufts Health Plan Foundation, AARP, New Hampshire DOT. So thanks, Tim.